Here at Spoonful of Strength, we want to make this podcast interactive. We want to hear your stories and we want you involved in our conversations. Follow Spoonful of Strength on Instagram, where we will post questions throughout the week. Your answers may be shared on our podcast. Do you have a story to share? Send us a message on Spoonful of Strength on Instagram with your health journey, and we may interview you on this show. Welcome to Spoonful of Strength, a podcast for people with chronic illness and the ones who love them, where we talk all things chronic. Here's your host, Rachel and Tina.
Thank you for joining us today on Spoonful of Strength. Today's episode is about getting the diagnosis, the process of finally receiving the diagnosis. And I know that can be a long, drawn-out process for many of them. How are you feeling this morning, Rachel?
I am doing all right. Going out later to my son's baseball game at 3:30. So I've got a couple more hours, and luckily I've had to miss quite a bit because of the weather with it being hot out. But I think today is supposed to be in the 70s. So it should be good to get out there and be able to see a game, because after my surgery, I won't be going out probably as much. So this might be the last game I see this season. So gonna do that. And yeah, that's about all I got going on today, except for joining you here. How about you? What are you up to today?
That is a good question. I think we're going to go out and do a little bit of shopping and then some yard work. Maybe. Depends.
Yeah.
They're calling for storms out here today, out here in Maryland. So just depends on what the weather is doing.
Yeah.
We're going to head up for the week to our seasonal campsite for the 4th of July holiday, which I know this will be already in the past by the time we air this. So just trying to get things staged on what all we want to bring up there. This is our first year up in that spot, so we're still trying to figure out things to bring up there, to leave there, and what to bring back and forth and all that stuff. So today we'll try to get organized and be ready to go on Tuesday.
Yes. We're recording this before the 4th of July, but when this airs, it'll be past 4th of July. So, like Tina said, we're going to talk about getting the diagnosis on today's episode. Now, I did post a poll on Instagram asking people how long it took for you to get a diagnosis. And I was surprised, but not surprised by the answers. So for those that received a diagnosis under a year was 6%, 1 to 3 years was 39%, 3 to 5 years was 0%, and 55% of the people that took this poll, it took over 5 years to get a diagnosis. What do you think about that, Tina?
That is sadly not, it's crazy, but sadly, I don't think it's uncommon.
Yeah.
When it comes to chronic illness. I think a lot of these, especially the ones that are more difficult to diagnose, a lot of times it seems to be the process of elimination, and that process is what can take so long. I mean, it took you quite a few years.
It took me from November of 2009 to October of 2015 to get the diagnosis. And mine, obviously, I have MS, and I know normally for MS, it is around that 5-year mark. So I was, right around 6 years. For me, what was frustrating is that I was a type 1 diabetic prior to having issues with my nervous system. And, my first symptom was when I went numb from my toes and it kept creeping up to my knees. And they kept saying, well, it's probably your diabetes. And I'm like, but my A1C is like perfect. Like I know for type 1 diabetics, they want your A1C to be like 7.0. I'm usually high fives, maybe low sixes. And so they kept saying, well, it's your diabetes or we just think it's a side effect from that. And so that was used kind of as an excuse, even when the MRIs came in with like lesions on my brain, it was still said it could be your diabetes. And what was frustrating for me is once they started changing their tune a little bit of, well, it could be MS, it was still a good 3 to 4 years past that because with MS, to be diagnosed with MS, because there is not one test that will diagnose it. It is, like you said, a matter of um, taking out all the other things that it could be and piecing together tests. But I know with MS, even once they started saying, well, this could be MS, it for them to diagnose me, they needed to see at least 2 relapses. So think about that. That's, 2 times they had to see that my symptoms got worse and then got better. And for people with MS, they could go, my first, they could go like years in between a relapse, but still feel bad. And so I had that initial instance in 2009, and then I had another one in 2011, and that's when they kind of started saying, well, it might be, but they still weren't sure. And so I had to go through testing and MRIs, and it took till 2015 for them to say, okay, we're going to run every test in the book and we're going to figure this out. So that was quite a few years of just being frustrated with these symptoms, and the fatigue was horrible, and all of that. It was really frustrating.
Did you get to a point where they were still, I guess, dragging their feet? Like I know they were dragging their feet, but it feels like that when you're waiting for a diagnosis. But
Yeah.
to the point where you feel like you weren't getting the diagnosis that you were pretty sure should have been coming. Like, did you start almost wishing for like that next relapse so that you could kind of get on the right pathway to diagnose and treatment?
Um, I think a little bit, yeah. I know we talked to, Myra a couple weeks ago with her MS journey and all of that. And it is mentally very tough because you almost do feel like, let me get worse so that they can figure this out so that then I can get treatment and get better. But
Right.
in the scheme of things, of course, I didn't want to have MS, but I wanted to know what was going on with my body. So whether it was we found something else or it is MS, sometimes you just feel like, I know it's not all in my head. So I need a diagnosis to be able to know that my symptoms, and it's not all in my head, my symptoms are real. Yeah. And when you think about that, you think, well, that's kind of weird to wish that you had MS, but I think it was wishing more for figuring out what it is so that you could get treatment. And of course, years down the line, there's no way in the world that I would ever want to be diagnosed with MS with everything that it comes with. So, did you have a long diagnostic process for your fibromyalgia?
I'm trying to remember. Gosh, it's been that's the sad thing. I was thinking about that the other day because I knew that we were going to be recording this episode. It's just been so many years and too much chemo for me to remember exactly. I do believe I think it took a while, only because with fibromyalgia, it's more of one of those like, nope, it's not RA. No, it's not, um, chronic fatigue. It was more of, at that point, it was more of a process of elimination versus a specific diagnostic. And even I remember when I was first diagnosed back then, fibromyalgia was kind of looked at as the people are making things up. disease, so to speak,
Yeah.
because there's no definitive testing to other than the trigger point, the points that the tender spots type thing.
Yeah.
So I do remember it being a while of just going to the doctors and trying different things, different medications to see if it would help with the general achiness and the headaches. But I just don't remember how, like, I can't put it in context of as far as how long it took, but
Yeah.
I do know that it was a long process.
I feel like our interview with Clarity, it was the same thing. Like the F&D was very similar in that, it doesn't have the diagnostic test and things like that to be able to put a label on it. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of illnesses are like that.
Yeah. And then and once you're like in your situation, like with your type 1 diabetes, I think that's a great example of if you are already um diagnosed with something,
Hmm.
um and you develop something else later down the line, their first initial response usually is, oh, well, that's related to, your diabetes or your MS or so they sometimes it takes longer to get a different diagnosis because they automatically assume that it's tied into the initial one.
Yeah, and actually that just reminded me of the fact that because I have type 1 diabetes and MS, and then within the last 5 years, I would say maybe 3 to 4 years, maybe, I've had pretty bad muscle weakness, and I have muscle weakness in the muscles around my lungs. I have muscle weakness in my colon. I have muscle weakness in my arms and my legs. And so my pulmonologist, my gastroenterologist, they both were saying, this is related to your MS. My neurologist was saying, no, it's not. And so for years, I was going back and forth with like, why am I experiencing this? Why am I having shortness of breath? All of these things. And the doctors couldn't agree on what it was. So
Mm.
I started seeing a rheumatologist just because I was like, okay, somebody's got to figure this out. And I think he's an internist as well. And he is the only one that's looking at the big picture. And I think that can get really frustrating. And he's looking for other things that it could be and looking at the symptoms individually and trying to put something together if I do have something else going on. But I've pretty much just given up on looking into what it is and just saying, well, it is what it is. And unless it gets worse, then I guess I'm just stuck here. And so, there can be that part of it of the doctors not even agreeing on, what if it is related to, one of the diagnoses that you already have.
Right. Yeah.
So we did ask on Instagram, what's the hardest part of the diagnosis process? Saturn Swirl 2 said for me it was all the tests. The worst was getting needles in my spine. Oh yes, if you're talking about the lumbar puncture, that's been I've had that. That's not fun. Um, but when we talk about tests, what's the worst test you've ever had?
That's a good question. Huh. Um, I would I would probably say the biopsy. They did the lymph node biopsy through the back. And that
Mm.
was mainly because I was just I even though it was being done under twilight, I still remember hearing the doctor go, "We need to bring her under more because she's feeling it." So,
Oh
um,
no.
I think that for me was the hardest, like physical one that I've had to go through. I mean, all the other ones are usually just scans, blood work, that type of thing. But that one I just remember only because I was feeling it. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
how about you?
Um,
Was it the lumbar?
that was pretty bad because they don't put you under for it. And so I was laying on my stomach, which is really uncomfortable to lay on your stomach on a hard table.
Right.
Um, but I just remember at some point I got like really lightheaded in the middle of the lumbar puncture. So it's, I can't move and I'm laying on my stomach and I'm starting to feel like I'm going to pass out and all of that. And I don't remember the recovery being too bad. I mean, obviously, we've talked to people who had really bad issues from lumbar punctures. I don't think the recovery was too bad. Um, I just remember the sounds and the feeling of the needle going in the back, and that was a hard one.
Did you know Spoonful of Strength is not just a podcast? We have an Instagram page called Spoonful of Strength where you can see clips of our upcoming episodes, learn about different illnesses, and we share other people's stories. We also have an Etsy shop where you can shop for clothing such as t-shirts and sweatshirts and hoodies. You can find candles and mugs and tumblers and blankets. You can find it all. We support all chronic illnesses, and the great thing is, if you find a t-shirt in our shop for multiple sclerosis, we can change that for lupus or Ehlers-Danlos or any other illness that you need. Everything is customizable in our shop. Use the code podcast for 20% off your entire order.
And I feel like as I've gotten older, I am more sensitive to like, okay, this is so stupid because I'm a type 1 diabetic. I give myself shots. I do all these things. A couple months ago, I cut my finger and had to have 4 stitches in my finger. I almost passed out getting them removed. I was fine getting the stitches in. I go in to have those suckers out and I am like pale and they're bringing me water and like it's so embarrassing. I'm like, I did fine getting them in, but getting them out, that I feel like I've gotten more sensitive to certain things like that as I get older. But I I know that the testing can be frustrating when you're trying to figure out a diagnosis, and especially like when the test results come back. I'm in a Facebook group with women with MS, and I bet I see at least 2 or 3 times a week of people posting their MRI or posting their lumbar puncture or posting their blood work and saying, I don't understand what this means. And that panic when you get the results, like in your My Chart of like seeing the test results and not knowing what it is and having to wait days, maybe even potentially, weeks to get like the diagnosis. And then you see something on the test that's abnormal. And then the doctor calls and is like, everything looked great. And you're like, well, wait a second. This was low. What does that mean? Oh, it's fine. It's fine. And that can be a little bit of a mental game. Have you experienced that?
Yeah. I remember there is one time I read my PET scan before I heard from the doctor, and there was like a mention of something that was like, I interpreted it as, oh my gosh, there's something coming back. But it was more of a there's something that's worth keeping an eye on type thing. But I was in a panic until I heard from the doctor, which was like I think a day or two afterwards, because I think she was actually out on vacation or something when it came through. But I was I don't remember I don't know if you remember that. That was
Yeah.
would have been in like 20 it was 2019 because it was during the time that we were when we were going through the being out of our house when had to have that mold remediation stuff going on. So I remember us being at the hotel in Annapolis when I did that. So it drives Dave nuts when I read the reports. He's always like, why don't you wait until the doctor calls you?
Oh,
and
you
then
can't do
finally
that.
my oncologist said, look, if you can read the reports, because I'm not going to call you if everything is fine.
Yeah. Yeah,
He's
they're
like,
not
so
in a
you don't
hurry
want
if
to hear
it's,
it. You don't want to see a phone call coming in from me
yeah,
after your report. So yeah, but it's easy. Like a lot of times I can always see right away the photos from the
mm,
scans, but I can't but it takes a number of hours. Usually I'm pretty lucky by the end of the day. The next day at the very latest, I can usually read my report, but I can always see the photos right away. So, and you know, of course, it's like, you know, trying to take a Rorschach test of like looking at them, going, okay, is that one better than that? And like, oh wait, that doesn't look right. Let me compare it to the one from the last time. And it's you got to be careful not to let yourself get wrapped up into trying
yeah,
to diagnose. So if you read
yeah,
them, definitely if you read your reports and you don't understand, take the time to give a phone call to your doctor's office and hope that they call you
yeah.
back.
Um, well, that brings up another good point of I feel like especially within the last couple years, communication with the doctor has gotten a lot more difficult. I know that I struggled. I've got a new neurologist because my neurologist retired. But when I was with him, the medical assistant was just not very good at all. And it was so frustrating for me to maybe see a test result pop up or have a new symptom and call into the doctor and then waiting and waiting and waiting. And there was one time that I called her and I said, I'm not sleeping at all. Like my mind is going crazy. I haven't slept in 4 or 5 nights. And it took her 10 days to get back with me and give me a prescription for a sleep aid that would help me sleep. And I called almost every day. And it took, I think I called her in September one year, and I was experiencing what I would assume was a relapse. And 4 months later, I still didn't have a medicine for the relapse.
Right.
And so I know that can be a frustrating part. I know for me, I started making like a journal of if I was doing phone calls, I would make a journal, left message, said this, got a call back. They told me this, and kept a journal of um, communication. But also lately, I'm using more of the messaging through the My Chart because then you have everything right there and you can look back and track everything. But how frustrating is the communication part?
Yeah,
Do
very
you think that
frustrating.
do you think it's gotten
It's
worse in the last couple of years?
it has. I've noticed that with my even with my doctors as well, and I don't know if it's the doctor itself or you know or the staff. Like you know, you never know, are they even getting the messages that you're sending? You
Yeah.
know, and that's the hard part as well. I like that being able to I do notice, and I don't know if you've noticed that I feel like I get more response or a slightly faster response by doing the messaging through the My Chart, and maybe that's probably because it's trackable.
Is it easier for them just to shoot you an email back versus having to find your
Right.
phone number and looking that up? And sometimes, at least for me, I'm always asking questions. So they're probably like, I'm just going to send her a message back because if I call her, she's going to have like 20 million more
Any
questions.
other questions? Yeah. So I
Yeah.
mean, it is quicker for them to answer for sure. You know,
Yeah.
because then they don't get tied up with long conversations. But it's frustrating. Like I called, you know, I saw my doctor on June 10th. I saw my oncologist, and that was when I see her back sometime in August, early August. And she said, okay, it's time for your next PET scan. And usually within the next day, I will get a phone call from the radiologist place that I go to schedule the PET scan. So I waited. I think I finally called. I just left a message and said, you know, the doctor ordered my PET scan. Usually I hear within a day or so about scheduling it, but you know, there were some new people at the desk. I just want to make sure that it got sent through properly and it didn't get overlooked. I never got a phone call back. Actually, I think I did it earlier in the week. Actually, I think I did it like Monday or Tuesday, because at that point it had been 2 weeks when I finally had called them, or when I finally realized I hadn't heard back. I never got a phone call back. I eventually on Friday I got a phone call from the place that does the PET scan about scheduling it, but the doctor's office never actually called me back to say, "Hey, sorry, we overlooked it," or whatever, and it got sent over. So that's also very frustrating. And I know that it was just, in their mind, they've got so many things to deal with that they're like, okay, problem was solved, but in the meantime, I don't know if the problem was solved or not. So,
Yeah.
yeah, the communication has been getting worse, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another listener, Joanne Robertson 19, said, being heard and listened to was the difficult part of getting that diagnosis. So struggle with
Yeah.
not feeling
Yeah.
heard from the doctors.
And at what point do you go for a second opinion?
Right.
Should that be the normal of getting a second opinion? Or like how do you trust a doctor that they know what they're talking about and that you're basically putting your life in their hands? And I got a second opinion um, when I was diagnosed. Um, and I also got a second opinion later on, after I'd been diagnosed, just because of the muscle weakness and things like that. But um, I hear a lot of people talk about medical gaslighting, and actually on Instagram, the Runcible Spoonie did say medical gaslighting. So how much of that is you think is going on right now? I seem to hear a
Um,
lot about it.
that's a good, yeah, I do. Um, I think it does happen somewhat. I don't know how. I never felt like I was gaslighted. I got lucky, with my doctors, and I guess I have a bit of an opinion of when just talking about going out and getting a second opinion. I think it's always a good idea.
Yeah.
Um, if the main doctor that your initial doctor that you're going to has an issue with you going out to get a second opinion, to me that would raise a red flag.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I when I had that reoccurrence with that single lymph node, I talked to my oncologist, and I was like, there's a doctor that's doing research for this particular cancer at Hopkins, and she's like, and I suggest we send you over there for a second opinion. So
Yeah.
she actually suggested that and was on board, like, anytime I've asked for any other type of, working with, even when I wanted to start working with the naturopath, she's like, yep, this is the one that I send patients there all the time.
Do you think that doctors, um, because I know I've done it and I don't know if you have either, but when you start thinking you may have something, you Google search, or you get your lab test and you Google search and all of that. Do you think that some doctors hate it when patients do that and that they just, you know, just shut you down? I mean, I've had it before where I've said, I've read this, and they, oh, no, 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 it's not that. And they just shut it down. Like, do
Right.
you think that's a problem? Because I think it's important for people to do research. I don't think you should go down in the rabbit hole too much, but you should know enough about it to say, this is what I've read, print the article out and get their opinion on it. But I wonder if there's some doctors that just irritates them.
Yeah, I think so. There was, who was it that was just talking about,
It
Myra.
was,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, Myra, that the doctor, came straight out and said, don't, stop Googling, stop Googling.
yeah,
But
yeah,
and I think that, and that's, it also doesn't help. I'll tell you another one that some doctors will shut down pretty quickly is, my sister is a nurse practitioner, and that specializes in
mm-hmm.
this, and she said, that it might be this. What do you think? Nope.
Yeah,
Like, you know, uh, some doctors do. And like I said, in my opinion, that's, I guess, it's frustrating, and then you're not feeling heard. It would be one thing, I guess, if you, versus shutting down, saying, that's interesting information, but I don't think it's this. I don't think that's what it is because A, B, and C, and they can explain why, then fine. But just to say, nope, that's not what it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you read it on Google and they're mad because you think you're trying to figure it out. But, also one thing to keep in mind that they should keep in mind too is that, and we'll talk about this, that it's a topic that might be our next one that we segue into, is it can take a long time to get into that specialist to start finding those answers. So what else are you going to do? You're going to be trying to figure out what's causing these symptoms, because you can't get in for the next 4 to 6 weeks to even start trying to see somebody to help you. So of course you're going to Google, but you're right in making sure that you don't let yourself go down that rabbit hole of
of almost, sometimes that can almost I don't want to say like trick your mind, but I mean give you more anxiety about the illness that you're not even diagnosed with yet. It can cause some anxiety and things like that. But you had mentioned the specialist, and I know it's getting harder and harder to get in. When I got a second opinion, they scheduled me 4 months out.
Yeah.
And when I switched neurologist because mine retired, I think I made the appointment in December or January, and I was booked end of March. So, I mean, it can be very difficult. That's probably why it's such a long process for some of these. You wonder if you had a specialist you could get into within a week and you got the testing done and all of that, if that would move a little bit quicker. But I know that's frustrating, has been frustrating for me in the past, of like, they're sending me to the specialist and then you've got to wait, 3 months just to be able to see him. And, that's a lot of time that you can kind of sit on that possible diagnosis. And,
and sometimes though, depending on the severity, like, don't be afraid of, if you're seeing your regular doctor or something, like, for example, when I was in the hospital with my cancer diagnosis, the oncologist, they admitted me so that I could actually start seeing, see my team that I was going to work with. So the oncologist said, okay, we need to move on this very quickly because it's already stage 4. So we need to see the urologist for these type of tests. I want you to get in there next week. I'm like, okay. So I call their office to try to schedule, and they're like, oh, he's booking like 4 months out. And I'm like, I don't think you understand. Like, we're trying, like, this is serious. This is, it's bad. She wants me to see him next week. Sorry, we can't see you for, another, until, like, let's see, that was in May. It was like, until September or something like that. And I was just so frustrated. And like, I finally just ended up calling my oncologist's office and said, this is what they told me. And then like 2 hours later, I get a phone call from the urologist's office and was like, we can see you on Monday. So, so sometimes, if you have a doctor that's trying to get some answers or get you in sooner, but you're not having any luck getting that appointment scheduled, don't be afraid to go back to the original person and see if they have any better luck with pulling some strings. And
or using your PCP in between that time, where if you're having more symptoms, so then at least it's documented, and they may be able to give you temporary relief, but use that in between. Having a chronic illness, my mood swings by the day, sometimes by the hour. Do you ever wish you could have a candle for every emotion you go through? Well, now you do. Introducing our emotion candles. Feeling anxious? Light our anxiety candle. Feeling tired? Light our pooped out candle. Feeling frisky, stressed out, sad? We've got you covered. See all of our designs at Spoonful of Strength on Etsy. That's Spoonful with 2 L's. Use code podcast for 20% off. So what about the mental side of the diagnostic process? Seeing that our Instagram poll is showing that most of us wait 5+ years. The emotional toll of having to wait for the diagnosis and getting all the tests done. I think that's a big part of the frustration, is just that mental part of it. Do you agree?
Oh, I agree. Most definitely that's it's very difficult to mentally navigate through that.
Yeah, especially if you're running into doctors that aren't taking your symptoms seriously, or you're not getting in, and you may feel like if I have MS or if I have this, that it could get worse just in the time of waiting to see a doctor. I think for me, a lot of it was anxiety of just, is this what it is? Why is this taking so long? It's not my diabetes. It's all of these things. And just the anxiety of the test results coming in, the anxiety of the lab work, and all of that was a lot for me. Did you experience that with your cancer, of just the anxiety of the waiting and the test results and all that?
Yeah, I definitely was more anxious. And that was the one thing I remember I kept saying, I just need to know the battle plan. And it was just such a, my situation was, it was just such a weird scenario that they weren't really sure which way to go about for treatment. And both doctors, the urologist and the oncologist, kept going back and forth with each other, but also with their colleagues and things, trying to figure out the best course of action. And that it was hard for me, because it's like, okay, well, I don't know what we're doing. So it was definitely better once they're like, okay, this is our plan. This is what we settled on. And for me,
how long did it take to get that plan?
It honestly didn't take a lot. Like, when you look back, like in the grand scheme of things, everything seemed to be taking so long. But from diagnosis to my start of chemo, which in the meantime, in between that was, a PET scan to see where it had spread, placing my port, doing the biopsy to confirm that it was the cancer, the type of cancer that they thought, coming up with that was like 3 weeks. But it just seemed to be taking forever in my situation. Yeah. But this was a different situation. Obviously with, stage 4 cancer, things move along a lot faster than, than a fibromyalgia or MS or anything like that type diagnosis. But, and that's one thing that, like, looking back now, I tell people that are just starting that cancer journey and all the advice I tell them is, it will feel like things aren't moving fast enough, but in the grand scheme of things, it's moving pretty quickly. So,
but even with, there are people with MS that they go into a, not like a relapsing, but any disease where they may have a bunch of symptoms all at once, and they may feel like panic because, they're having all of these symptoms and nobody can figure it out. And where mine was more of like, okay, well, these symptoms are bothering me every day, that my fatigue is getting worse, but I was still functioning fairly well. And I was still getting frustrated, but there are some illnesses or some symptoms that come on quickly that I can imagine somebody going, okay, well, last week I was walking fine and now I can barely stand, and all of these things that come up all of a sudden that can give you a little bit of panic of like, why isn't anybody taking this seriously, or why isn't anybody moving fast enough? Don't they understand, what's going on, and nobody's giving you answers? I can imagine how frustrating, that would be.
It's also hard to keep in mind because it's like as you're waiting for that diagnosis and hearing from the doctors and such, it's like how many other people are also in the same situation. So
Mhm. Yeah. And I think being in a group like this of the Spoonful family of, you see it all the time of people like, I am not diagnosed yet, but I'm pretty sure this is what it is. And just being on that feels like a hamster wheel sometimes.
one of our other Instagram followers on that question of the hardest part of diagnosis, Gia Mora said it's different. One of the hardest parts for her was remaining hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I can definitely see that.
Yeah.
When you're frustrated, you haven't gotten those answers yet. It's hard to be hopeful that you ever will um, find out what's going on and how to even treat something like that in the future.
Yeah. So you waited 3-4 months to get in to see the specialist. What are some things that you can do? Because a lot of times you get a doctor for 10 minutes, maybe 15. What can you do to prepare for that visit that's so important that you've waited so long for?
Write your questions down versus relying on
Mm-hmm.
your memory of what,
Yeah.
because once you get in there, you're going to forget everything that you'll be on your way home going, oh shoot, I meant to ask that question. So definitely go
Mm-hmm.
in with a list of questions.
Yeah. I do that to this day. I also, when possible, have somebody come with me because sometimes, even though I have the questions written down and they may have answered those questions, I will still leave that visit and go, what did she say about this? What was it that she said I could take, for supplements? What is that test that she wants me to do and things like that. So if you have somebody there to make sure all of your questions are answered, but then also,
Yeah. And also ask, if you can't, if somebody can't go along with you, maybe just asking the doctor, hey, can I, as we discuss these, do you mind if I record them? And I'm
mm-hmm,
bad about I write the questions down and then I'll jot really quick notes as we're talking, but I do it really fast because I'm still trying to listen as well. And then later I go to try to read the notes and I'm like, what the heck was I even trying? What was this even about? Like
mm-hmm,
you're trying to recall what you were writing down and you're like, I don't even know why I wrote this down. Like, what is this supposed to mean? So,
yeah,
um, yeah, definitely having
yeah,
that other person or asking for permission to be able to record the conversations to be able to play back. Because you're definitely on, especially in the early days, you're on
mm-hmm,
so much information overload.
yeah. Pre-diagnosis is, or even to have a support person there. Sometimes you never know when you're going to get a diagnosis.
Right.
There was
Right.
a time where I went into a routine appointment and then I came out with a diagnosis and I was like, what just happened? Like, I wasn't expecting it. Um, and so having somebody there, when my husband can't come to my appointments, I've got somebody that I call right after my appointments and just say, okay, this is what he said. And, just a support person to get it out while it's fresh in my head, but also
Mm.
in a case that you receive any bad news or anything like that, it's nice to have somebody on your side and to talk about it and all of that. Family, friends, whoever that might be for you.
Do you
But
find that because you had that unexpected diagnosis when you weren't expecting just a regular appointment, do you find that you get a little more anxious on even just routine appointments now?
well, that was a little bit more recent, so I'm not sure. But I think with that one, what had happened is I had respiratory um testing, and from me reading the report, everything looked the same. But there was
Okay.
a second test that was done where the report was not released. And
Uh,
so I went in thinking everything, we're maintaining our poor muscle weakness, it's at the same level. Well, there was
right.
another test that they did that wasn't on the report that
Gotcha.
showed that I had the chronic
You weren't
bronchitis. But
expecting.
I remember years ago, and this isn't funny, but I look back on it and I think it's funny, but it was like 2019 or something like that. And I was going in just for like a regular GYN appointment. And I had mentioned to Ed that, I keep going into these appointments. They keep giving me bad news. This is like a routine women's thing. Everything's going to be great. And I remember walking back in the house, throwing my purse on the table and going, my uterus is falling out. And my husband's like, what are you even talking about? I'd found out I had prolapse uterus and had to have a
Right.
hysterectomy. And I was like, I can't have one stinking appointment where everybody's like, everything's great.
Everything's
It's
fine.
all good, and so, yeah, it is. But at this time, I almost feel like I'm just used to, you know, I'm used to it by now. Like nothing surprises me anymore.
You're at the point
And
of
so,
actually leaving an appointment going, wow,
yeah, like I'm more
that was
surprised.
normal. Yeah. You're more
Yeah.
surprised
Where
when
I'm
it's a
almost,
normal appointment anymore.
yeah, I'm expecting to hear something either falling out, rotting, or, falling apart. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah, that's kind of, where I'm at. But having a support system is definitely, um, good as you're maneuvering through that. Another thing just popped in my head is having somebody with the same person consistently with you can ride the ride with you and be able to, say, well, 2 months ago we were here, and like process it as a whole journey, not just as a doctor's appointment.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yep. 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 Absolutely.
So as we wrap up the episode, I think from two people who have been through completely different um, diagnosis paths of just doing your best to be patient, but also have the information and be an advocate for yourself. It's not a big deal to message the doctor asking for test results when it's been a week past. It's okay to call your nurse and say, I haven't received a response back from my email I sent, or whatever it might be. Finding that balance of, being your own advocate and helping to get to the diagnosis quicker, but also understanding, I mean, things take time and all of that. What would be one piece of advice to wrap this all up that you would probably have?
I would say that it would be don't let yourself fall too deep into your own head.
Yeah. Google search is good, but it can also be, and I think you need to have a little bit of knowledge of what you may think it could be or what the test results mean, but it can go too far, especially mentally. So I think that's great. And one last thing, I think the reason that we're here is to create a community of people who've been in the same situation. So reaching out to people within your Instagram group, within your Facebook group, within TikTok, or whoever you might have, and say, this is what I'm going through. I saw that you've been diagnosed with XYZ. What are some things I should ask, or what are some things that I should do? And relying heavily on family and friends to support you through that journey, because as we've seen through our poll, it can be a journey. It can be a lengthy journey. That's just our experience going through our diagnosis. Definitely a rough journey. We wish you well, and of course we are always here. Send us a message on Instagram, Facebook, as we are always here to support this community. So, well, let's see what we've got going on the rest of the week. So, on Thursday, we will be interviewing Michelle. And she is going to talk about her diagnosis of primary ciliary dyskinesia. Funny enough, Michelle's episode will air the day of my surgery. So I will be really enjoying her episode at 8 a.m. when I am under anesthesia. So, but yeah, so we'll be talking with Michelle on Thursday. And I hope your week is well, full of energy, void of pain, and just have a great week. Talk to you soon. Take care.